If you have a true scary story you want to share with the channel, just go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. About 8 years ago, my now husband and I had finally bought our first house together. I was 33, him 35, and I was excited to finally have a place to call our own. We had always rented prior. One of the things I was most excited about was having a decent yard that I could decorate myself. I had recently lost my grandmother, and she always loved gardening. She ended up in a nursing home towards the end of her life, and one of the last things she mentioned was how much she missed her garden. So, now with my own yard, I wanted to make a garden dedicated to her. She loved lilacs and peonies, so I was going to plant lilacs along the house. They smelled wonderful anyways. And then I thought I would plant some peonies in a raised box towards the back. I also planned on planting some butterfly bushes and wild flowers to help the bees and butterfly population, but it seemed like some people had other ideas. The first few months of us moving in involved more of getting to know the neighbors and getting unpacked. We moved in late autumn, and gardening was not on my mind at that point. I wanted to have my home set up first, so we got to know the neighbors as you normally do, with them being nosy of the new people. That's not me being mean either. Most of our neighbors are actually really nice, and even reliable. They would see us outside and holler to us, and then come over and introduce themselves. One of the people that did this was our neighbor to the right, Dan. Dan was a bit older, I think in his 60s, but he seemed to be a very by-the-book guy. One thing that I should explain, our neighborhood was not part of an HOA, or homeowners association. I cannot stand the thought of that and how controlling it is, so it was something we looked into when we chose our home. However, Dan seemed to want it to be part of an HOA. With his introduction, he gave almost like a rundown of how the neighborhood functioned. Trash pickup is every Friday, recycling every other Friday. We don't put our bins out until Friday morning, otherwise it just looks trashy to have them sitting there all night. We have a quarterly city council meeting that's open to anyone that wants to attend. I'm the lead speaker, so if you have any concerns or questions, you can just tell me. I'm the one that runs it all anyways. I could instantly tell the type of guy that Dan was. He tried to run that neighborhood, absolutely. But while I thought he could definitely be a pain, he couldn't enforce anything. So I just braced myself to potentially have one of those types of difficult neighbors. Ultimately, I was not going to let him get in the way of having my dream home. As spring arrived, I began working on my yard and plotting out the gardens. As I was marking the stakes, Dan popped his head over the little fence and asked what I was up to. I started explaining my ideas, and mid-sentence he interrupted me. Lilacs get too tall. And the wildflowers, those are an eyesore. You'll be digging it all up when it's blooming when you start getting all those bees, he said, laughing. I've dealt with my fair share of judgmental folks, so I smiled politely and said that that was the point. I wanted to attract the bees because they are important, and the lilacs are important to my grandmother. He laughed again and made some remark about me being some kind of hippie. We both laughed, but not for the same reason, and I continued working on my yard. Dan watched for a while and then left. Then, the problems started occurring. A few days later, I went out to start plotting my seeds, and I noticed my stakes had all been disturbed. They looked to be walked over, pulled out, and trampled. I was confused, but more so disappointed by it. There were no clear prints from shoes, or a foot, so I assumed that something may have just gotten into our yard. The front yard was open, but there was an arched gate to get to the back, which was surrounded by a very old privacy fence. It was falling apart in one of the back corners, and we were planning on fixing it that year, or the next, depending on our budget. With how it sat, I thought that something could have crawled under the fence. I just got over it. Thankfully, I hadn't planted anything yet. I was just outlining where everything was going to go, so I just had to quickly redo it. Then, it happened again. This time, I had already put in my bulbs and planted my lilac bushes. When I went out there to look at it, there were holes in the ground. And before anyone asks, these weren't from moles. I had experienced those in my last home and was familiar with what they looked like. These holes looked like they were done haphazardly with a hand shovel. Some of my bulbs looked damaged, like they'd been hit. And some were even just sitting on top of the soil. I just remember standing there, trying to balance a lilac bush while fixing the soil around it, when I heard Dan behind me, slurping his coffee. He asked me what had happened, and I told him that I had no clue. I was upset, so I explained how I had planted everything and that something was digging it up. He immediately had an idea as to what was happening. According to him, a long time ago, the owner of my home went insane and started killing things from humans to animals and burying them in the yard. He claimed that that brought bad omens to the house and said that the previous owner moved out because of issues with the house being haunted. He then said that that probably affects the yard too, since I may be disturbing remains. The problem with this theory was that it was total BS. My dad actually knew the previous owners. They were an older couple that moved to be closer to their grandkids. That was it. Not to mention stuff like that has to be on the details of the house. Then there's also the fact that I do not believe in ghosts. I'm not a fan of paranormal stories in the slightest, because they never really bode true to me. So when he finished his explanation, I laughed. I made a joke about it, and Dan seemed annoyed. Maybe he was offended or something else, I wasn't sure, but he just eventually walked off and I went back to fixing my garden. A few days later, I was leaving for work, and as I stepped outside, I could smell something really bad. It was almost sulfuric smelling, and I just remember it making me gag. I just assumed, since it was trash day, maybe someone threw away something that was pretty rank, and that it would be gone by the time I got home. Unfortunately, it wasn't. The stench was still there when I got home, and it was so bad that I couldn't even open my windows. I didn't work on the yard at all that week, until the following weekend because of other things taking up my time. But when I finally got back to it that weekend, I had a surprise waiting for me. Everything had been planted at this point. I just needed to clean up a few things and put it in my small fence to mark it off, to make sure that we didn't hit anything with the mower. But, once again, my seeds looked disturbed. The dirt was scattered with a small hole on one side, and a larger mound on the other. I sat on the ground, ready to just even it all out and give up on the idea of having a neat row of flowers. At that point, they were just going to be scattered, but it would be alright. But as I moved the dirt, with my bare hands, mind you, I touched something solid in the dirt. Not thinking much of it, I grabbed it and pulled it out some, and then realized it was a rabbit. Knowing that there was a dead rabbit in my garden, and that I just touched it, I screamed. My husband was in the shed, so he ran over to me as I wildly explained what I just found. As we stood there observing the rabbit and wondering how it got there, who would pop their ugly head up but Dan? He was just watching when I finally saw him in the corner of my vision. He was looking around and asked what was wrong, when my husband told him what I found. The whole time, he didn't have a single look of concern or shock. This man that thought the neighborhood revolved around him wasn't disturbed that something or someone had partially buried a rabbit in my yard. With my suspicion growing, I asked him if he knew anything about it, and his response was, "Well, I told your wife about the yard being haunted. The previous owner didn't like big gardens because he would bury people in it." I was livid. I knew everything that had been happening had to have been him. He didn't like my plans from the beginning. He tried everything he could other than flat out telling me not to do it, probably because he had no leg to stand on. He had to have been the one to put the rabbit there too, trying to scare me. So I did what any sane person would have done. I walked over and grabbed the rabbit, again with my bare hands, walked it to the fence, and I chucked it right at Dan. That's when he looked shocked. He finally had emotion on his face. I yelled at him about being a controlling creep. I told him that if he trespassed again, I would call the cops, and I went back inside. A few days later, I put up a no trespassing sign and ordered a camera to watch the gate. I wasn't worried about the yard itself, because he was older and larger and kind of wobbled at times, so there was no way he was going to be jumping the fence. He most likely was just opening the gate and walking right in. Surprisingly, I didn't have any issues with my yard, and my garden wasn't touched after that. Dan never talked to me again. He wouldn't even look at me. Sometimes he would say hi or something to my husband, but never to me. I'm sure it went around the neighborhood that I was crazy too. I know what I did was far from the most rational response, but at the time, I was too upset. I was trying to make a simple memorial garden for my late grandmother, and all he wanted to do was stop me. And for no real reason but to be a controlling dick. However, it did seem to solve the problem of our neighbor's unhealthy obsession with controlling our yard. I worked for a lawn and landscaping company for several years. I made some mistakes as a young adult, causing me to get my GED late, so finding a good paying job in my 20s was difficult. But this company took me in, and I really felt like they gave me a second chance. And I will always be grateful for them. However, we still worked with the public, so we definitely got a fair share of weird and memorable customers. This is a story about one of them named Larry. Larry was a longtime customer that we remembered because of one of his weird requests. He claimed to be satisfied with our services, except he wanted us to use his weed whacker only. He claimed that the wiring he used was less damaging to his grass. I don't think our boss believed it, but it was cheaper than the stuff that we used, so he actually bought some that he installed on a few machines to specifically use at his place. Once he showed him, he seemed satisfied, and we started using our own equipment. We had a policy that we couldn't use a customer's equipment for safety reasons, so at least the owner was willing to work with the customer. Other than that specific demand, Larry was an alright guy. He was friendly enough to all of us, but also stayed out of our way. And his wife was old-fashioned and tried to offer us drinks all the time. Very kind people. They would occasionally have yard games or kids' toys in the yard. Typically, they picked those up before we got there, but if we did find some, Larry just asked us to toss them in a small shed in the back. No big deal. I had 2 very young kids of my own at the time, and I knew that you could only ask them to do something so many times before you had to just do it yourself, or possibly forget it. On this day, We started working on the yard, when I spotted a few toys in the back. I picked them up and, per the norm, I started walking them over to the shed. As I stood in front of the shed before I opened it, I noticed that it now had a padlock on it. However, it was only on the one handle and obviously unlocked. I noticed it because Larry never had a lock on the door before. I just assumed that maybe he had issues with trespassers, or was worried about the kids getting in there by themselves. It was one of those moments that I noticed, didn't think much of it because it wasn't any of my business anyways, and proceeded to open the door. But once I entered the shed, I was provided with a different sight. It was definitely a makeshift lab, but not for drugs, but explosives. I saw wiring, weird pipe pieces, metal scraps, and several packages of powder and bottles of liquids. What the hell was I looking at? Not to mention, I had already had a run-in with the law, and I knew that I wanted no part of any of this, so I calmed myself, tossed the toy in the shed, and walked out, just humming a song. I walked in humming and was trying to stay calm. That all nearly crumbled when I saw Larry standing right outside the shed. He looked pissed. I wasn't expecting him to be standing there, so it made me jump. I tried to laugh it off, but he asked me what I was doing in there. I just calmly pointed out the items in the yard that I was putting away. He tried to argue with me that it was locked, but I pointed out the lock on the handle and explained that it was already unlocked and open. I also tried to point out that this is what we had always done. Literally, per his instructions. His demeanor changed. It reminded me of the calm but obviously upset voice a parent would use on their child when they wanted them to admit something they did. I'm familiar with it because of my own parents and how I use it on my own kids. He asked me what all I saw in the shed. We both knew the answer to this. He knew what I saw, and I took this as him trying to intimidate or threaten me. I tried to think fast to get myself out of the situation and back to my job, so I could never think about it again. So, I tried to play dumb. I acted kind of excited about it. What, with the chemicals? Yeah, it looks like you're making your own fertilizer, right? I figured you would. Your lawn is a lot greener than the rest of the block. I then tried to BS something about using a certain enzyme to help with growth, with the purpose of boring him, I hoped. I was really trying to look naive, and to my surprise, it seemed to work. His shoulders dropped, and his eyes softened. He no longer looked on the defensive, so I thought I was successful. He told me that that was correct, and thanked me for my advice, apologized about the toys, and then dismissed me to get back to work. I started walking away and finished my work, but the rest of the time there, I felt his eyes on me. I avoided talking to anyone that I worked with unless it was loud enough for him to hear, so he knew that I wasn't talking about him. I continued working, or would make jokes, hoping to keep him off of my back too. But he still watched me, making me feel incredibly uncomfortable. As we left, Larry was back to being his normal friendly self, and when we were all back at the shop, or home, I was still thinking about what I saw. I knew there had to be something bad going on in that shed. I contemplated on what I could do, if anything, for a few days. I also tried to be reasonable. Maybe all the chemicals were there for a completely harmless reason, but I really couldn't think of any. I knew what some of the things were that I saw. I won't name them here for obvious reasons, but from what I knew of them, there was not a good reason to have them. It didn't make sense, and knowing he had at least one child and a wife, I knew I needed to tell someone. This was long enough ago that I drove to a gas station, used a payphone on the side of the building, and left an anonymous tip. I told them that I was a neighbor, but I didn't want to give my name, and I explained what I saw in his shed. I told them how they seemed very suspicious and secretive about the shed, and that I was worried about the chemicals that he stored in there. I think it may have helped that we were in a drought, so the risk of a fire was pretty high. I felt awful afterwards. I worried that maybe I was just overreacting. I worried that they would find out it was me, and then I would be punished. By authorities, by Larry, by my work. My work and my little family was all I had at the time, so I couldn't afford to lose my job. But I also couldn't just keep my head down, especially if I would eventually have to go back there. Luckily, I didn't have to do that. It was about 2 weeks later that it was finally on the news, not to mention talked about at my work. Police went to Larry's home and said that they were given a tip that they were required to follow up on. The thing is, at first, it was just a request. They could have been told to come back with a warrant, but part of the reason that it escalated and was in the news was because Larry immediately went on the defensive. He apparently refused to even let them in the house, ended up locking himself inside the shed, and threatened to end his own life. When they finally got to him, they found all the same things that I saw and confirmed my suspicions. Something had happened with Larry's job. It wasn't specified, but he was angry about it. He planned on blowing the office up and going out with it. Thankfully, none of that occurred. The news said that he was apprehended beforehand and was being tried for a bunch of things. I don't remember the exact outcome, but I do know that they were trying to go with an insanity defense. I was honestly shocked to find out what happened as I followed the story. Larry was such a nice guy in the beginning. He knew how things worked. He talked to all of us like we were friends. And then, something happened to him, and I witnessed the beginnings of it. Then it all spiraled downward for him. Part of me still feels bad for calling it in, but at the same time, I have to remember that I could have saved so many lives. And that's what I stick with. That's what I choose to hold on to. And I instill in my kids, now in their teen years, that if you see something, say something. Tell someone you trust, because you don't want to live with the regrets of not doing anything after it's too late. If you don't subscribe, your socks will never match again for the rest of your life. Don't risk it. Subscribe today. My twin sister, Erin, had owned her home for quite some time now, but had recently gotten a divorce. I won't go into those messy details, but because of his actions and the settlement, she got the house. However, she had never been the gardening and yard work type. Her, now ex, usually took care of that, and they had very little decor or even variety because of it. However, once he was gone, it was all up to her. Sometimes, if I was free, I would go over and mow for her, but being a full-time dad and husband, and not to mention working myself, I didn't have a lot of free time. So she ended up looking up gardeners and landscapers for hire. She started paying to have someone mow and de-weed every other week. She did have a small yard and was planning on having a small decorative garden put in, like bushes and hardy plants. Things that she didn't have to worry about dying easily, knowing her. One day, I had to drop something off for her, and her gardener was there, putting in the raised bed. She introduced me to him. I'll call him Jack. And she explained how he was very thorough and had a deep knowledge of plants. She said that she was thankful for him because he helped her choose what plants would be best for her yard, based on how much sun it would get and the type of soil that she had. He had on a collared shirt with a logo on it, and he was very polite, so at first glance, he seemed professional and kind enough. I mean, he was just helping with the yard and the plants, thinking he can't really go wrong there, right? The following week, I found myself ending up at Erin's place a few times because of things that brought us together. I had to drop off something she was borrowing, pick up her laptop, and try to fix it. She even watched my 2 kids when my wife and I took her mom to the hospital for surgery. Every time I was there, Jack was also present. He was always out in the yard, and the first few times, nothing seemed strange. He was just working on the garden. But by the 3rd time, and me not seeing that much had changed, I asked Erin about it. She said that Jack had troubles finding the plants because the ones that he got were in poor shape or looked already dead, so it was delaying him. As mentioned, she knew very little about plants, so I asked her if she saw the plants and if she was paying for them all because I was worried that he may have been doing it just to charge her more. She claimed that she asked about that too, and he said that he wasn't, that it was his fault for not checking them first. So I just told her to keep track of how long it took, worried that maybe he would try to charge more for the labor. I know that that was probably wrong of me, I admit, but it was something that happens with some small contractors, so it was a legit concern. However, Erin did not like to look helpless or naive, so I knew when it was time to let it go, and that's what I did. I didn't ask much about it after that, and just anticipated seeing her garden once it was done, and seeing how happy my sister would be. Anyway, after seeing Erin several times that week, I didn't see nor talk to her much the following week. Sometimes we would text sporadically, but I had been really busy, so our chat fell pretty silent. However, I was working from home on Friday, and my wife went to a friend's for a playdate with the kids, so I had the house all to myself. After living with kids for 6 years, the house is way too quiet when they're gone, so I decided I would surprise my sister with lunch. She didn't work on Fridays, so I assumed that she would be home. I called her, and when she didn't answer, I just decided to go over there first. I sent her a text to let her know I was on my way at least, and I headed out. When I pulled up, I didn't see her car, but she did have a garage, so it could have been in there. She typically parked in the garage unless she was in a rush. I checked my phone before I got out and frowned when I saw that I had no missed calls and no reply to my text. It was unusual for Erin to go so long without responding, so I found it odd. But maybe she was busy, or just didn't have her phone on her. But when I approached the door, that's when my stomach dropped. The door was sitting slightly ajar. Erin would never forget to close her door. I knew that something was wrong, so I called 911, but I dropped my phone in my pocket. I slowly walked in and looked around the dark and quiet room. There was no movement, but the air seemed tense. I was immediately put into fight or flight mode. I walked partially to the right to check the kitchen, but it was empty. So I started walking towards the hall to the back. The hall led to stairs on the left that goes up to the bedrooms, and to the right was a mudroom and office, including a door that led to the backyard. I slowly walked down the hall and leaned over to check in the mudroom, and it was empty. Lastly, I had to check upstairs. As soon as I turned to go upstairs, I looked up and saw a dark figure of a man staring down at me from the top of the stairs. I said something along the lines of, "Oh crap," and before I could process anything, the man came running down the stairs at me, full speed, like I was about to be charged. My first reaction was to be on guard, so I put myself in that stance. The guy pushed me back, causing me to fall into the mudroom. He nearly jumped over me and ran out the back door. I yelled out to the man to stop and chased after him. He'd gotten pretty far ahead, but I knew who it was as I watched him run away. It was Jack, no doubts. He was even in one of the same collared shirts. I stood in place knowing that there was no way I would catch him until I heard Erin yelling my name. I started walking back towards the house where I saw Erin standing in the doorway, holding my phone to her ear. I had forgotten that I even called 911, so she was talking to them and trying to ask me what was going on. She had on sweatpants and an old shirt. Was she asleep? I wondered. I told her what had happened, and she handed the phone back to me for me to explain it to them. I followed Erin back to the front, where a cop was also standing, and asking her questions. Everything kind of melded together at that point. Erin said that she had a migraine, so she went upstairs to take a nap. She didn't wake up to my call, or text, until she heard me yelling downstairs. I gave a full description of Jack, and so did Erin, and I confirmed that it was him, without a doubt. The color of Erin's face was gone, as I explained what I saw. She confirmed that not only did he not have any reason to be in her home, but he had no reason to be there at all. He had completed the work earlier that week. I didn't want to think about what his intentions were. Luckily, they were able to find him, and he was arrested. You see, I was under the impression that Erin had done research on the company, or person, she hired, as in looked at reviews and such. But, in actuality, she only did her review based on the conversation and quote she got from him at the time of the meeting. After looking at the company itself, I learned a lot. He was supposedly the owner of this small local company, and many reviews I saw talked about how the guy seemed very nosy. He would ask to use their bathroom, and when he didn't return for several minutes, he would be found looking around their home. Some of them said that it was just suspicious. Some of them said that things went missing, but they couldn't prove that it was him. After our experience, I could believe it. This guy may not have adjusted his prices, but it seemed like he just took what he wanted in return. Thankfully, Erin didn't find anything missing or out of order, so I may have stopped him before he was able to take anything. I just try not to think about what could have happened if he saw her in the room alone. From that day on, Erin is a lot more cautious when it comes to looking for hired help. She now understands how crucial it is to do those checks and reviews before making a decision. Now, I just have to get past the fear that something could be wrong when she doesn't respond to my calls or texts immediately. So that, my friends, was today's collection of scary gardening and landscaping stories. Nobody lost any fingers this time around, thankfully. I mentioned that because last time, this is only the second time I've ever done this topic, because these aren't common stories, but the other time I did this topic, there was a story of a guy who lost his fingers in a lawnmower accident, because he was completely hammered. Obviously don't wish it on anyone, but you probably shouldn't work on lawnmowers while you're drunk. Just saying. Anyways, good collection of scary stories that involve gardening, landscaping, yard work, etc. Now, let me tell you, I personally do not like doing yard work. I like having nice plants outside and growing and whatnot and so forth, but the majority of my yard work that I have to do is mowing the grass, and I hate mowing our yard. I know you might say, geez, Raven, don't be so lazy, it's just a chore, you have to do it, and that's fine. It's not that I hate mowing grass in general. Whenever I was a kid, I had to mow the yard at the house that we lived in, and I did it all the time whenever I had to do it. Obviously, well, not all the time. You know what I mean? And I didn't mind it. It was fine. But it's this yard specifically. Because right outside of our back patio gate is this hill that's lumpy and super steep. It's not a large yard, mind you, but that hill is super steep, and there's no way to approach it with a push mower that makes it easy to mow. Because it's steep in 2 directions. I think that would be that would be north, so that would be west. So it is a northwestern slope. Like, it is like a square slope that goes north and west, and the slopes are very sharp. So it just kind of sucks. It's just a pain. And for some reason, I don't know the reason. I really don't. The grass in our yard is super, like, thick and lush. It's thick, if you know what I mean. Like, that grass is thick with a Q. I'm trying to be a cool person. I'm trying to be like the kids, so just accept that. Anyways, like, if I don't mow it every pretty much week, whenever I go to mow it, it is so thick that it kills the mower every time. I have to pretty much push the mower over it, raise it slightly up, and go over it, and then pull it back over it a second time. And that, like, I mean, I guess I could just go over it with it on, like, what is the highest on the mower? I have 7, 8 for the wheels. I don't remember. But it just, I would have to go over it a second time anyways. But what I'm saying is, it's just super thick and lush, and it kills the mower. Like, it stops the blade because of how thick it is. And it doesn't look like that in any other yard. So I don't know why we were, I guess, cursed or blessed with, like, the best grass in the world. But I hate it. I want to kill all of it. I want to throw something to kill all the grass and just plant clover and wildflowers in all of it. Just throw, like, Dollar Tree boxes of wildflower seeds and clover seed and just have an entire clover and wildflower yard. The front yard's nice, though. It is actually mostly clover and wild violets. Our front yard is filled with wild violets, and it's super cool. I still have to mow it, but it's super cool. I like the front yard. Front yard's fine. Front yard takes me 10 minutes to mow over, and I don't have to just cut the grass. The grass is fine. It's the backyard that sucks. I'm done complaining. Yeah, I don't like mowing our yard, and I have to mow both our yard and our neighbor's yard because it's a duplex, and she doesn't have a mower, and I'm not going to be that jerk that just mows my half of the yard and is like, you have to mow your own yard. I'm not going to do that person, so. Anyway. I kind of went off the rails there. Good, scary stories about lawn mowing and gardening and landscaping and so forth and so on. Thank you for those who submitted the stories or those who let me use their stories elsewhere. You guys are amazing. Without you guys, I wouldn't have the content to do. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. Consider subscribing if you're new to the channel, and leave me a comment if you're feeling bold and want to do so. You can also join Patreon or memberships for get early access to content like this and other things depending on what you sign up for and how you sign up. Now, all that said, my friends, hope you're having I'm trying to speed through this. Hope you're having a beautiful week so far. Great weekend. Hope I see you again here very soon. But until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you are the best you that you can be. Do not forget it. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. And until I see you again, my friends, much love, and as always, sleep well.